The Asheville Digital Archives Foundation sits on a quiet street corner in downtown Asheville, North Carolina, where old brick buildings stand shoulder to shoulder like elderly relatives at a family reunion. The foundation occupies the third floor of what was once a tobacco warehouse, its tall windows overlooking the misty Blue Ridge Mountains that rise and fall in the distance like the chest of a sleeping giant. Inside, the November morning light filters through those windows, casting long rectangular patterns across workstations cluttered with computers, light boxes, high-resolution scanners, and photographs in various states of restoration. Sarah Mitchell arrives at 7:30, earlier than usual, carrying a thermos of coffee and the weight of another sleepless night. At 42, she has spent the last 15 years of her life bringing damaged photographs back to life, coaxing details from water-stained tintypes, reconstructing torn daguerreotypes, and digitally removing the cruel fingerprints of time from images that families thought were lost forever. Her colleagues call her a photographic archaeologist, though Sarah herself prefers the simpler term, restorer. She has steady hands, patient eyes, and an obsessive attention to detail that has earned her a reputation throughout the Southeast as someone who can see what others miss. The photograph that will change everything arrived 3 weeks ago in a flat archival box, carefully wrapped in acid-free tissue paper and accompanied by a letter from the Madison County Historical Society. The letter explained that the image was taken in August of 1891 outside the Mount Zion Baptist Church in a small Appalachian community called Shelton Laurel, a place whose name carries dark historical weight for those who know their Civil War history. The church itself burned down in 1947, struck by lightning during a summer storm, and this photograph is believed to be the only surviving image of the original structure. The Historical Society wants it restored, enlarged, and prepared for a permanent exhibition about Appalachian religious life in the late 19th century. Sarah removes the photograph from its protective sleeve with the care of a surgeon handling a living heart. The original image is a 4x5-inch albumin print mounted on stiff cardboard, its edges browned and curled, its surface marked by the tiny cracks and discolorations that come from more than a century of existence. The photograph shows approximately 30 people standing in 3 rows on the steps of a modest white clapboard church with a simple steeple. The subjects are dressed in their Sunday finest. Men in dark suits with high collars, women in long dresses with their hair pinned up severely, children standing stiffly in front with expressions of uncomfortable formality. Everyone is white, as was typical for segregated churches in that time and place. Everyone is looking directly at the camera with the solemnity that long exposure times demanded in that era. The first step in any restoration is documentation. Sarah photographs the original from multiple angles, notes every crack, stain, and area of degradation in a leather-bound journal that she keeps for each project. She measures the image, records the type of print, estimates the original exposure time based on the slight blur visible in one child's hand. Then comes the scanning process. She uses a high-resolution flatbed scanner capable of capturing details at 12,800 dots per inch, far beyond what the human eye can perceive unaided. The scanning takes 40 minutes, the machine moving with mechanical patience across every millimeter of the photograph's surface. When the digital file appears on her computer screen, Sarah begins the meticulous work of digital restoration. She works with layers, building up the image like an artist creating a painting. She removes scratches digitally, carefully cloning nearby pixels to fill in damaged areas. She adjusts the contrast gently, bringing out details that have faded over the decades. She corrects the yellow cast that has crept into the whites of the image, restoring the clothing and church walls to something closer to their original appearance. Hours pass. The morning becomes afternoon. Sarah's coffee grows cold in its thermos. It is during the enlargement process that she first notices something unusual. She has zoomed into the left side of the photograph, working on a particularly stubborn water stain that obscures part of the church's foundation, when she sees it, a shape that does not quite fit. At first, she thinks it is simply damage to the photograph, perhaps a shadow created by improper storage or a chemical reaction in the original development process. But as she works to clarify the area, enhancing the contrast and adjusting the exposure, a form begins to emerge. It is definitely a person, or rather the suggestion of a person, kneeling at the far left edge of the church steps, partially obscured by what appears to be deliberate overexposure or perhaps intentional fading. Sarah leans closer to her monitor, her heart beginning to beat faster with the peculiar excitement that comes with discovering something unexpected. The figure is small, child-sized, or perhaps a kneeling adult, positioned in a way that places it outside the main composition of the photograph but definitely within the frame. The person appears to be wearing light-colored clothing, possibly a simple dress or shirt, and their head is bowed as if in prayer or perhaps in an attempt to avoid the camera's gaze. Most remarkably, while every other person in the photograph is clearly visible and properly exposed, this figure seems to have been almost erased, existing in the image as a ghost of proper photographic density. She calls over Marcus Chen, her colleague and the Foundation's technical director. Marcus is 35, brilliant with imaging software, and possesses the kind of methodical skepticism that makes him invaluable when Sarah's imagination threatens to run away with her discoveries. He rolls his chair over from his own workstation, bringing the smell of the Chinese takeout he has been eating for lunch. Sarah points to the area on her screen without saying anything, wanting his unbiased first impression. Marcus studies the screen for a long moment, his dark eyes narrowing with concentration. He zooms in further, examines the pixels, checks the histogram that shows the distribution of light and dark values in that section of the image. Finally, he speaks, his voice carrying the careful precision of someone who deals in facts rather than speculation. He confirms that there is definitely an additional figure in the photograph, someone who was present when the image was taken but who appears to have been deliberately underexposed or possibly even partially obscured during the original photographic process. This is not damage to the photograph, not a chemical artifact or a shadow. This is a person who was there, standing or kneeling at the edge of the church steps, but whose presence was somehow minimized in the final image. The discovery sends a current of questions through Sarah's mind. Who was this person? Why were they positioned apart from the main group? Most importantly, why does their image appear so faded compared to everyone else in the photograph? She knows enough about 19th century photographic techniques to understand that creating such selective exposure would require deliberate action on the part of the photographer, either during the actual photographing or during the development process. Someone made a choice to make this person less visible. Someone decided that this individual should exist in the photograph as barely more than a suggestion, a presence that could easily be overlooked or dismissed. Sarah spends the rest of the afternoon working to enhance the mysterious figure, using every tool in her considerable digital arsenal. She adjusts curves, manipulates individual color channels, applies careful sharpening to bring out details without creating artificial artifacts. Slowly, incrementally, the figure becomes clearer. It is definitely a young person, possibly a teenager or young adult, kneeling on the bottom step of the church with their hands clasped in front of them. Their clothing is simpler than that of the people standing behind them, lacking the formal details visible in the Sunday clothes of the congregation. Their posture suggests submission or perhaps prayer, but there is something about the angle of their head that speaks of exclusion rather than devotion. That be why the time Sarah leaves the Foundation that evening, stepping out into a cold November night where the mountains are invisible beyond the darkness, she has made a decision. This photograph is not just a restoration project anymore. It has become an investigation, a mystery that demands to be solved. Somewhere in the records of Madison County, in the archives of churches and courthouses and historical societies, there must be information about who this person was and why they were nearly erased from this image. Sarah drives home through streets lined with bare trees, their branches skeletal against the streetlights, and thinks about invisibility, about the ways that people can be present yet unseen, documented yet forgotten. The Madison County Courthouse sits in Marshall, North Carolina, a small town tucked into a bend of the French Broad River where the mountains press close on all sides. The courthouse itself is a handsome brick building from the early 20th century, its architecture speaking of civic pride and permanence. Sarah makes the 40-minute drive from Asheville on a Wednesday morning when the sky hangs low and gray, threatening rain that smells of coming winter. She has called ahead and spoken with Patricia Hammond, the county archivist, explaining her discovery and requesting access to records from the 1890s that might shed light on the Mount Zion Baptist Church and its congregation. Patricia is a woman in her late 60s with steel gray hair cut in a practical bob and reading glasses that hang from a beaded chain around her neck. She has been the county archivist for 32 years, and she knows the contents of her domain with the intimacy of a librarian who has spent decades in conversation with the dead through their carefully preserved paper trails. She leads Sarah down to the basement archives, where the temperature is kept deliberately cool and the air smells of old paper and preservation chemicals. Metal shelving units march away into shadows, holding boxes and bound volumes that contain the bureaucratic memory of the county, birth certificates, death records, property deeds, tax assessments, court proceedings, and church records dating back to before the Civil War. Patricia pulls down several boxes containing records from Mount Zion Baptist Church, carefully preserved after the church burned down in 1947. The records are fragmentary, some damaged by water before they were properly archived, others simply incomplete. 19th century record-keeping in rural Appalachian churches was often inconsistent, dependent on the literacy and diligence of whoever happened to be serving as church secretary at any given time. Sarah settles at a research table with a pair of cotton gloves to protect the fragile documents and begins the slow work of reading through handwritten pages that chronicle baptisms, marriages, deaths, and the ordinary administrative details of church life. The congregation of Mount Zion in 1891 consisted of approximately 40 families, most of them engaged in small-scale farming in the steep mountain valleys that surround Shelton Laurel. The church records list names that still echo through the region: Shelton, Chandler, Norton, Rice, Moore. These were families who had lived in these mountains for generations, their roots going back to Scots-Irish immigrants who had pushed into the Appalachian frontier in the late 1700s. The records show a community bound together by faith, kinship, and the shared hardships of mountain life in an era before electricity, before paved roads, before the modern conveniences that would eventually make such isolation less absolute. Sarah finds the entry for August of 1891, the month when the photograph was taken. The church secretary at that time was a man named Elijah Shelton, and his handwriting is remarkably clear, each letter formed with the careful precision of someone who took pride in his literacy. He notes that a photographer from Asheville arrived on Sunday, August 9th, to take a portrait of the congregation for $10, paid from the church's building fund. The photographer's name is recorded as Howard C. Brennan, and a note indicates that he produced one print for the church and kept the glass plate negative for his own archives. The entry also mentions that the weather was clear and hot, perfect for outdoor photography, and that approximately 32 members of the congregation were present for the photograph after the morning service. But there is no mention of anyone kneeling apart from the group. No explanation for the faded figure at the edge of the frame. Sarah reads through the surrounding entries, looking for context, for any detail that might explain what she has found. The weeks before and after the photograph show the routine business of church life. A baptism, a funeral, a dispute over the cost of repairing the church roof. Nothing unusual. Nothing that would explain why someone would be positioned separately during a formal church photograph and then nearly erased from the final image. Patricia suggests another avenue of investigation. The Madison County Historical Society has collected oral histories from elderly residents over the past 50 years, many of them recorded in the 1970s and 80s before those who remembered the late 19th century passed away. These recordings sit in a climate-controlled vault, digitized now but originally captured on reel-to-reel tape by volunteers who understood that memory is as fragile as old photographs and just as worth preserving. Sarah spends the afternoon in a small listening room, wearing headphones and working through interview after interview, listening to the voices of the very old speaking about the very past. Most of the recordings contain the expected material, reminiscences about farming, stories about the Civil War passed down through families, descriptions of church services and camp meetings, accounts of feuds and marriages and the ways that mountain communities maintain their identity through isolation. But in one interview, recorded in 1979 with a woman named Alma Chandler Rice who was 94 at the time, Sarah finds something that makes her sit up straighter in her chair. Alma is talking about Mount Zion Baptist Church, where her grandparents and parents were members, and she mentions almost in passing that there was always a story in her family about a photograph taken when her grandmother was young, A photograph of the whole church that caused some kind of trouble that no one would explain to the children. The interviewer, a young volunteer whose voice sounds impossibly fresh and enthusiastic on the decades-old tape, asks what kind of trouble. Alma's voice on the recording is thin and wavering with age but still sharp with memory. She says she never knew exactly, just that it had something to do with someone who should not have been in the picture or maybe someone who should have been in it differently. Her own mother had told her that some photographs could capture shame as easily as they captured faces, and that the church photograph from before Alma was born was one that people learned not to ask about. The family story said that the photograph was put away in a trunk and not displayed with the other church memorabilia because of this unnamed complication. Sarah rewinds the section and listens again, making careful notes. The interview moves on to other topics, and Alma passes away 2 years after the recording was made, taking whatever specific knowledge she might have had into the silence beyond memory. But the fragment she has left behind suggests that Sarah's discovery is not an accident of photographic chemistry or an error in processing. The faded figure represents something real, something that caused discomfort in the community, something that was deliberately minimized but not completely erased. The rain begins as Sarah drives back to Asheville that evening, a cold, steady downpour that turns the mountain roads slick and treacherous. She thinks about the nature of historical evidence, about how much is lost not through accident but through choice, through the countless small decisions that communities make about what to remember and what to let fade into obscurity. Photography was supposed to be the ultimate tool of preservation, the technology that would save faces and places from the inevitable erosion of time. But Sarah is learning that photographs can lie through omission just as easily as words can, that the frame of an image can be a choice about what to include and what to leave out, and that even within a single photograph, some people can be made more visible than others. The breakthrough comes from an unexpected source. Sarah has been working on the photograph for 6 weeks now, and her enhanced version clearly shows the kneeling figure, though many details remain frustratingly unclear. She has posted about the project on a professional restoration forum, describing the technical aspects of the discovery and asking if anyone has encountered similar cases of selective exposure in 19th century photography. The responses are interesting but not particularly helpful until a message arrives from a professor of photography history at Duke University named Dr. Leonard Washington. Dr. Washington is in his 50s, an African-American scholar who has spent his career studying the representation of Black Americans in 19th and early 20th century photography. He has written extensively about the ways that photographic conventions both reflected and reinforced racial hierarchies, about the visual codes that signaled who belonged and who did not. His message to Sarah is brief but pointed. He has seen many photographs from the post-Civil War South where Black servants or workers appear in family portraits, usually positioned at the edges of the frame, often standing while white family members sit, sometimes partially obscured or underexposed in ways that seem to reflect their marginal social status. Would Sarah be willing to send him a high-resolution copy of the image she has been working on? Sarah does, and Dr. Washington calls her 2 days later. His voice over the phone carries both excitement and a kind of sadness that comes from years of studying historical injustice. He explains that what Sarah has found is not unique but is rare enough to be significant. The figure in the photograph is almost certainly a young Black person, probably someone who worked for the church or for one of the white families in the congregation. The positioning and the deliberate fading of the image are visual strategies that photographers and their clients use to acknowledge the presence of Black individuals while simultaneously marking them as different, as not fully part of the group being documented. It was a way of including them in the historical record while simultaneously keeping them at a visual distance, maintaining the racial boundaries that were central to Southern society in that era. This explanation reshapes everything Sarah thought she understood about the photograph. Mount Zion Baptist Church was a white congregation in a region where slavery had been less economically dominant than in the plantation South, but where racial hierarchies were nonetheless firmly established. After the Civil War, Black families in Madison County existed in a complicated social space, legally free but economically dependent, technically citizens but excluded from most white institutions including churches. Some Black families worked as hired help for white families, some sharecropped on land owned by whites, some found precarious independence through manual labor and resourcefulness. Their presence was acknowledged, but their participation in white community life was strictly limited. Sarah returns to the Madison County Archives with new questions. This time she is looking not at church records but at census data, tax records, and the fragmentary documentation that might reveal the presence of black residents in Shelton Laurel in 1891. Patricia the archivist proves invaluable in this search, her encyclopedic knowledge of the archive guiding Sarah to documents she would never have found on her own. The census records from 1890 show 14 black residents in the Shelton Laurel area, most of them living in small households on the edges of white-owned farms. The names are recorded with the bureaucratic simplicity typical of the era. James Norton, Sarah Norton, their 3 children. Thomas Rice, a single man listed as a farm laborer. Mary Chandler, a widow working as a domestic servant. One name stands out. Clara Freeman, listed as female, age 15, living in the household of a white family named Shelton, occupation recorded as general servant. The Shelton family were prominent members of Mount Zion Baptist Church. The household head, William Shelton, served as a church elder. Sarah knows from the church records that the Sheltons were present for the photograph in August of 1891. It seems more than likely that Clara Freeman, their young black servant, would have been brought along to the church that day, perhaps to help manage the Shelton children during the service, perhaps simply because the family did not want to leave her alone at home. With Clara's name in hand, Sarah can begin to trace a more specific history. Birth records are spotty for that era, especially for black children, but death records are more reliable. Sarah finds Clara Freeman's death certificate dated April 3, 1943. She died in Asheville at the age of 67, the cause of death listed as pneumonia. The certificate indicates that she was married, her husband's name recorded as Joseph Freeman, and that she had 4 children, all still living at the time of her death. The certificate also lists her parents. Mother unknown, father listed as Robert Freeman, deceased. The word unknown beside mother's name is significant. In that era, it often indicated that the mother had been enslaved or had died shortly after childbirth, or simply that the person filling out the paperwork had not known or cared enough to record the information. It speaks to the gaps in historical documentation that disproportionately affect those who had less power, less status, less value in the eyes of record keepers. Clara Freeman's life has left behind only these fragmentary paper traces, and were it not for her faint presence in a church photograph, even these few details might have remained undiscovered. Sarah locates a local genealogist named Robert Matthews who specializes in African American family history in western North Carolina. Robert is in his early 40s, a middle school history teacher who spends his free time helping people trace their roots through the complicated maze of incomplete records that characterize black genealogy in the South. He meets Sarah at a coffee shop in downtown Asheville on a Saturday morning when weak December sunlight struggles through the clouds. He has brought a thick folder of notes and photocopied documents, the accumulation of years of research into the Freeman family line. Robert explains that the Freeman family descended from people who had been enslaved on a plantation in South Carolina before the Civil War. After emancipation, many of them migrated into the mountains of North Carolina, seeking land and opportunity away from the plantation regions where their bondage had occurred. They settled in scattered locations around Madison County, working as laborers, domestics, and small farmers. Clara Freeman's father, Robert Freeman, had worked as a laborer on various farms before dying young in a logging accident in 1897. Clara herself had worked for the Shelton family from childhood, essentially raised in their household, sleeping in a small room off the kitchen, eating the leftovers from the family's meals, wearing hand-me-down clothing. At age 20, Clara married Joseph Freeman, a distant cousin, and they moved to Asheville where Joseph found work as a porter for the railroad. They raised their 4 children in a small house in the black neighborhood that existed east of downtown, a community that was eventually destroyed by urban renewal in the 1970s. Their children went on to have families of their own, and Robert has traced Clara's descendants to the present day. Several of them still live in the Asheville area, unaware that their great-great-grandmother exists as a ghost in a photograph from 1891. Sarah asks Robert if any of Clara's descendants would be willing to speak with her. Robert makes some calls, and 3 days later Sarah finds herself sitting in the living room of a woman named Dorothy Freeman Williams, who is 78 years old and Clara Freeman's great-granddaughter. Dorothy's house is in East Asheville, a modest brick ranch filled with family photographs that cover every available surface. Dorothy herself is small and sharp-eyed, her gray hair cut short, her hands showing the arthritis that comes with age but still steady as she pours coffee into china cups that belonged to her own grandmother. Sarah shows Dorothy the enhanced photograph on her laptop, zooming in on the faded figure kneeling at the edge of the church steps. Dorothy studies the image for a long time, her face unreadable. Finally, she speaks, her voice carrying the particular authority of someone who has spent a lifetime understanding her family's place in a complicated history. She says that her grandmother, one of Clara's daughters, had told stories about Clara's youth working for the Shelton family. The Sheltons had not been particularly cruel by the standards of the time, but they had been clear about Clara's position in their household and in their community. She was allowed to attend church with them, but she was not a member of the congregation. She could sit in the back during services but could not participate in communion or baptism. She existed in their world but not as an equal, her presence acknowledged but her humanity diminished. Dorothy says that the photograph, with Clara kneeling apart from the white congregation, captures that reality with painful precision. It shows exactly how Clara existed in that community, present but separate, visible but faded, documented but marginalized. The photographer might have thought he was being inclusive by allowing her to appear in the image at all, or perhaps the Sheltons insisted she be there because she was caring for their children that day. But the decision to underexpose her image, to make her presence less definite than the white members of the congregation, was a choice that reflected the racial attitudes of that time and place. It said that Clara Freeman mattered less, that her image deserved less space, less light, less permanence. Sarah asks if she can share this discovery, if she can tell Clara's story as part of the photograph's restoration and exhibition. Dorothy is quiet for a moment, considering. Then she nods and says that yes, the story should be told. Clara's life was hard, shaped by circumstances she could not control and injustices she could not escape. But she survived, she built a family, and her descendants are here now, living lives that would have seemed impossible to that 15-year-old girl kneeling at the edge of a church photograph in 1891. Forgetting her would be another kind of erasure. Remembering her, telling her story honestly, is a way of bringing her fully into the light. Sarah spends January working on the final restoration and preparing materials for what will become a much different exhibition than the Madison County Historical Society originally envisioned. The photograph itself requires delicate handling. Sarah's goal is not to completely fix the image, not to make Clara Freeman's figure as prominent as the white congregation members. Instead, she wants to make Clara visible enough that viewers cannot overlook her, while preserving the evidence of how she was originally rendered nearly invisible. It is a technical challenge that requires balancing enhancement with authenticity, bringing Clara into focus without erasing the historical truth of her marginal position in the original image. Marcus helps her develop a presentation strategy that uses digital layering. The main exhibition will show 3 versions of the photograph side by side. The first is a high-resolution scan of the original, showing Clara as she appears in the damaged, faded print, barely noticeable unless you know where to look. The second is Sarah's enhanced version, where Clara's figure has been carefully brought out through digital restoration, making her presence undeniable. The third is an enlarged detail of Clara herself, her kneeling figure isolated and enhanced to show as much detail as the aged photograph will allow. Together, these 3 images tell a story about visibility and invisibility, about who gets remembered and how. Sarah also prepares extensive documentation to accompany the photograph. She has written a detailed account of her discovery and investigation, including excerpts from the church records, the census data, the oral history recordings, and her interviews with Robert Matthews and Dorothy Freeman Williams. She has included historical context about race relations in Appalachia after the Civil War, about the particular position of black domestic servants in white households, about photographic practices and the ways that technical choices could reinforce social hierarchies. The exhibition will not simply display a restored photograph. It will tell Clara Freeman's story and use her experience to illuminate broader truths about whose histories get preserved and whose get erased. The challenge is that not everyone wants these truths illuminated. When Sarah presents her findings to the Madison County Historical Society in a board meeting in early February, the reception is mixed. Some members are fascinated by the discovery and enthusiastic about the exhibition's potential to attract attention and funding. Others are uncomfortable with what they see as an overemphasis on racial issues, arguing that the original intent was simply to document the church building and that Sarah has turned a straightforward restoration project into something politically complicated. One elderly board member, a descendant of one of the families photographed in the image, expresses concern that the exhibition makes their ancestors look racist, which he insists is unfair judging by modern standards. Sarah listens to these objections carefully, but she does not back down. She explains that she is not interested in condemning anyone or passing judgment on people who lived more than a century ago under very different social conditions. Her goal is simply to tell the truth about what exists in this photograph and what that reveals about the past. Clara Freeman was there on that August day in 1891. She was part of that community even if she was not treated as an equal member of it. Making her visible in the historical record is not a political act. It is an act of accuracy, of completeness, of honoring a life that deserves to be remembered. After considerable debate, the Historical Society votes to proceed with the exhibition, though not unanimously. They agree to Sarah's presentation approach and approve the accompanying documentation. They also agree to invite Clara Freeman's descendants to the exhibition opening and to include their perspectives as part of the program. This last point is important to Sarah. She does not want this to be a story told about black people by white people. She wants Clara's family to have a voice in how their ancestors' story is presented. The exhibition opens on a Saturday in April, when the mountains are covered with the pale green of new leaves and the dogwood trees are blooming white against the forest's darker backdrop. The Madison County Heritage Museum, where the exhibition is housed, is packed with visitors. Local press has covered the story of the photograph's discovery, and the unusual nature of the project has attracted attention from regional media as well. People line up to view the 3 versions of the photograph, reading the detailed explanatory panels that Sarah has prepared, listening to audio excerpts from the oral history interviews that are available through headphones at listening stations. Dorothy Freeman Williams attends the opening with 6 other members of Clara Freeman's extended family, including 2 great-great-grandchildren who are in their 20s and had known almost nothing about Clara before Sarah's research brought her story to light. They stand together in front of the enlarged image of their ancestor, this young woman kneeling at the edge of a church gathering, and Sarah watches their faces as they take in what this photograph represents. There is sadness there, certainly recognition of the injustice that shaped Clara's young life. But there is also pride, a sense of connection to a person who survived circumstances that could have destroyed her and built a legacy that continues in her descendants. During the formal program, Dorothy speaks to the gathered crowd, her voice clear and steady despite her age. She talks about what it means to discover a new piece of your family's history, especially when that piece reveals painful truths about the past. She says that looking at this photograph of Clara is difficult because it shows so clearly the barriers that existed in that time and place, the ways that race determined who was included and who was marginalized. But she also says that seeing Clara there, seeing evidence of her presence and her endurance, is powerful. It is proof that she existed, that she mattered, that her life left marks that can still be discovered more than a century later. A local reporter asks Sarah if she thinks there are other photographs like this one, other images where people have been deliberately faded or marginalized in ways that render them nearly invisible. Sarah says she knows there are. Photographic archives are full of images where domestic servants, laborers, or other people of lower social status appear at the edges of group portraits, positioned and exposed in ways that minimize their presence. What makes this particular photograph significant is that Sarah happened to notice Clara's faded figure and chose to investigate rather than accept the image as it appeared. She wonders how many other Claras exist in photograph collections, their stories waiting to be uncovered by someone willing to look closely enough. The exhibition runs through the summer and into the fall, attracting thousands of visitors and considerable media attention. Several other historical societies and archives in the region reach out to Sarah, asking if she would be willing to examine photographs in their collections, looking for similar cases of marginalized or obscured figures. A graduate student from Appalachian State University begins a thesis project on Black domestic workers in western North Carolina, using Clara Freeman's story as a case study. Dorothy Freeman Williams works with Robert Matthews to compile a more complete family history, gathering documents and stories from the scattered branches of Clara's descendants. For Sarah, the project represents something important about the nature of restoration work. She understands now that bringing old photographs back to life is not just a technical process of removing damage and enhancing clarity. It is also an ethical process of deciding what deserves to be seen, what stories need to be told, whose presence in history should be acknowledged. Every photograph makes choices about what to include and what to exclude, what to emphasize and what to diminish. The job of the restorer is sometimes to question those original choices, to bring into focus what was deliberately left obscure, to make visible what was meant to be overlooked. On a cool October evening, Sarah returns to the exhibition space after hours, when the museum is closed and quiet. She stands alone in front of the three versions of the photograph, looking at Clara Freeman's kneeling figure in its various states of visibility. She thinks about how easy it would have been to miss this person entirely, to restore the church photograph without ever noticing the faded form at the edge of the frame. She thinks about all the ways that people become invisible in history, not because they did not exist or did not matter, but because their presence was inconvenient or complicated or simply not valued enough to preserve carefully. The photograph from Mount Zion Baptist Church in 1891 will never be perfect. Too much damage has occurred over the decades, too much information has been irretrievably lost to time and chemistry and deliberate erasure. But Clara Freeman is visible now in a way she was not before. Her story has been recovered, documented, shared with hundreds of people who would never have known she existed. It is a small victory against the forces of forgetting, a reminder that history is not fixed but is constantly being revised as we discover new evidence and ask new questions. Sarah turns off the lights in the exhibition space and walks out into the mountain night, where the stars are visible overhead and the air smells of autumn leaves and wood smoke from distant chimneys. She thinks about the work that remains to be done, the other photographs waiting in archives and attic trunks, the other stories that deserve to be brought into the light. The work of restoration, she understands, is never really finished. There is always something more to discover, someone else to remember, some part of the past that needs to be seen with new eyes and honored with careful attention. The photograph will remain in the museum's permanent collection, a testament to one young woman's presence in a moment of history and to the persistence required to make that presence visible. Clara Freeman's descendants will continue to come see it, bringing their own children and grandchildren to show them where their family's story intersects with the broader history of their region. And perhaps other restorers, working with other photographs, will remember Sarah's discovery and will look more carefully at the edges of their images, searching for figures that were meant to fade away but that deserve instead to be brought into the light where they belong.